I remember the atmosphere that week. It wasn't just arid, it was charged. The kind of dryness where every footstep on brittle grass sounded like shattering crystal. The wind felt like it was scouring the skin from your bones. The county had issued a Stage 5 fire prohibition. No open flames, no barbecues, not even a contained fire pit. I'd seen seasons like this before, back in my days as a first responder. Every time it felt this way, something eventually ignited. My grove bordered the eastern fringe of the subdivision, a parcel that had been in my bloodline since my grandfather's time. He planted the first citrus rows. My father put in the almond trees. I grew up climbing those limbs, took a few falls, and later taught my daughter to judge ripeness by shade, not pressure. Those trees weren't just plants, they were a living chronicle. So when I spotted HOA personnel hauling burn barrels and propane tanks near the property line, a cold dread pooled in my gut. I approached, not hurried, not furious, just resolute. The way you move when you've been tasked with stopping infernos, not igniting them. I could tell they didn't know me. Most of the new board members didn't. Since the last election, the board had become a revolving door of ambitious transplants, realtors, an insurance agent, and a man who marketed solar panels and spoke endlessly about curb appeal. "Excuse me," I said, pausing at the edge of the fresh gravel. "You're aware of the total fire ban, correct?" The woman in charge turned slowly, a clipboard in her grip, a crimson blouse with a stitched HOA emblem on the breast, and a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "We have a maintenance waiver," she stated. "No, you don't," I replied, my tone even but firm. "Not for open burning like this. I confirmed with the county this morning. There are no exemptions for HOA landscaping at this time." She blinked. "Sir, with all respect," I held up my phone, displaying the PDF straight from the fire captain's office. "This was issued 10 hours ago, and I submitted a notification to your board last week reminding them I sent it certified." She didn't take the device. Instead, she turned back toward the crew and waved them off. "Let's hold here, team," she said, then looked back at me. "We'll verify and continue if we're cleared." I didn't believe her. That night, I sent another email. I attached the notice again, included timestamped images, and copied the county fire captain's office for good measure. The next morning, I discovered scorch marks in the tall grass less than 20 feet from my outermost trees. Black and ash coated a section of my irrigation line. No calls, no apologies, not even a knock on my door. That was the moment I understood I wasn't dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with hubris. I've learned something over the years. People don't always respect cautions. They respect repercussions, and this HOA believed they were exempt from both. I submitted a formal grievance with the county. I also requested aerial footage from a neighbor who operates a small photography service. He'd captured it all: crews, gas canisters, unapproved burning, and HOA staff laughing as if it were a weekend picnic. Still, no one from the board responded. No calls, no acknowledgement. 3 days later, the wind shifted. If you've never experienced a Santa Ana, it's difficult to convey. It's not a gust, it's a pressure. A force that rolls down from the high desert and drops like an anvil, parched and abrupt. That morning, it blew from the south, carrying a scent I will never forget. Singed plastic, eucalyptus, and something else, citrus bark. I sprinted outside barefoot. From the ridge behind my grove, I saw smoke rising, not a column, but a growing wall, and then flames, fast and horizontal, moving like a living entity. They raced through the dry scrub the HOA had neglected to clear. I yelled for my daughter to grab the emergency bag. By the time I reached the back gate, the fire had already consumed the eastern fence. I tried to hose it down, but the water pressure was too weak. The damn HOA had restricted our flow for conservation. My own land, and I couldn't even defend it. I fell to my knees as the first line of trees caught. 20 years of pruning, of composting, of tracking every frost by calendar, and I watched it all burn. I don't cry often, but I'll confess, when that first tree split in the heat and collapsed inward, I screamed. And in that scream was something more profound than rage. It was betrayal, because I knew this was preventable. They had been cautioned. I cautioned them, but they didn't listen. They never do until the damage is done. The next day, I walked the burn line as if it were a crime scene, because to me it was. My boots crunched through what was once rich loam, now gray and brittle like pulverized bone. The citrus trees nearest the fence were reduced to blackened spears. Flames had stripped them clean. I found a half-melted nozzle from my irrigation line, warped and twisted like a scream frozen in plastic. The air still reeked of scorched earth and fuel. And then came the ultimate insult. The HOA had the gall to send me a notice, a violation notice. According to their letter, I was being cited for inadequate firebreak upkeep and failure to control flammable growth along the shared boundary, which in their words may have contributed to the rapid spread of a controlled HOA-sanctioned burn. I held the paper in my hands and stared. Not in disbelief, I was well past that, but in cold, rising fury. They had started the fire. They had disregarded warnings. They had broken the county's fire prohibition. And now they were attempting to pin the blame on me. I called the number on the notice. No answer. I emailed the board. No reply. Finally, I marched straight into the HOA office, a prefabricated building with a fake stone front and tinted windows as if it were pretending to be a financial institution. A young receptionist looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with the person who authorized this," I said, placing the paper on the counter. "That would be Mr.
Kevin Riles. He's in a board meeting." "Then I'll wait." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. I waited, and when Kevin finally emerged, it took him a full minute to place me. "Oh, Mr. Baxter, Yes, regarding the violation. You sent me a violation notice, I stated, cutting him off. After your burn destroyed half my grove. Drayton tucking the clipboard under his arm like a shield. It was an approved maintenance procedure. No, it wasn't, I said. I have copies of the county band photographs and aerial footage showing your team igniting fires during a red flag warning, and you're trying to ignore your duty to maintain a proper defensible space, he retorted, attempting to sound composed. My property line, I said, stepping forward, was green, healthy, and lush. Yours was choked with dry brush you never cleared. And your fire crossed onto my land. His eyes darted. We're still compiling the facts. I laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. No, you're trying to cover your tracks. That night, I went to the HOA's website and began pulling records, meeting minutes, agenda items, permit applications. I cross-referenced them with public county archives. Nothing aligned. There had been no permit issued for a controlled burn, no coordination with the fire department, no alert to residents. But there were minutes from a closed session 3 weeks prior where they discussed a vegetation management initiative. Buried in vague terminology, the intent was clear. They'd planned this. They believed they could tidy the common areas with fire. It was inexpensive, click, and they didn't want to pay for professional removal. It was reckless, unlawful, and now they were trying to make me the scapegoat for the fallout. That's when I made my choice. I contacted an old comrade, Caleb, who had retired from the fire captain's office the previous year. We had served together on a wildfire assignment up north. He still had connections. I asked if he'd come by as a personal favor to walk the burn line with me. He did. He brought a camera, a notepad, and his intuition. Sam, he muttered, crouching near a stump. This was no controlled burn. This is arson by negligence. You think it's actionable? I asked. He stood and pointed toward the fence. This is encroachment, and if you can demonstrate prior notice with their refusal to comply, yeah, you've got a case, a major one. I handed him the certified mail receipt and the drone images. His eyes widened. The county fire department is going to devour this. 2 days later, investigators arrived in high-visibility vests with spray paint cans. They marked points of origin, measured heat spread, and took statements from neighbors. The HOA tried to stop them, claiming it was private property. It didn't matter. Once you set fire to someone's land during a countrywide ban, it ceases to be a private matter. Word traveled fast. Some neighbors came to offer sympathies. Others whispered about past events, how the HOA had penalized a single mother for leaving a kiddie pool in her yard or threatened an elderly couple over wind chimes. Small things, but stacked high like tinder. By the week's end, I was gathering sworn statements from residents. Every single one recounted a similar narrative: abuse of power, silence, intimidation. And yet, despite the proof, despite the burn ban, despite the charred remains of my grove, the HOA board refused to concede fault. We regret the unfortunate spread of the burn, Kevin wrote in a public statement posted on the community forum, but believe all correct protocols were followed. I printed that out and highlighted every falsehood. Then I filed a lawsuit not merely for damages but for gross negligence, willful endangerment, property destruction, and violation of county emergency directives. They wanted to play with fire. Now they were going to feel the heat. The fire reached the first row of trees just past noon. It began small, so insignificant that if you hadn't been trained to observe flame behavior like I had, you might have believed it could be contained. A wisp of orange creeping through the undergrowth, a flicker darting up the base of a fig tree. Then the wind intensified, not a breeze but a steady, determined shove, as if nature itself had chosen violence. The flames surged forward as if ravenous, cracking limbs with heat before they ever touched bark. The fire crowned, leaping from treetop to treetop faster than any hose could hope to combat. I stood near the irrigation valve, hand frozen on the metal as the first almond tree fractured down the middle and folded like parchment. I didn't hear myself shout, didn't realize I'd sprinted into the smoke until my daughter Ellie seized my arm and pulled me back toward the house. "Dad, stop," she yelled, coughing. "We have to go." "But the Rose 7 it might know," she cried, tears streaking her soot-covered face. "They're gone, Dad, they're all gone." I looked back once more. It was true. The grove I'd spent half my life cultivating, the one my father had nurtured before me, was collapsing row by row. I could see the tags I'd written by hand: Golden Bell, Crimson Heart, Starlight Citrus, curling in the heat and vanishing into smoke. It was like watching generations turn to ash. We retreated quickly toward the shed, which I'd constructed years ago with fire-assistant siding and an independent sprinkler system. That small building, ironically, held more than tools. It held every ledger, every crop journal, every note my grandfather had scribbled in the margins of old paperbacks with ideas about irrigation patterns. It was our true family archive. I triggered the emergency system. Water sprayed across the rooftop and along the ground perimeter. For a moment I thought it might hold, but just then a flaming branch came arcing through the air like some furious torch hurled by the heavens and landed dead center on the roof. It exploded into flames instantly. Inside I heard something collapse, a muffled crash, then shattering glass. Ellie screamed. I pulled her back as the roof buckled and the shed imploded with a hiss of steam and the roar of memories evaporating. That was the moment I broke, not in fury but in grief. I sank to my knees in the gravel driveway and just stared. For a moment the fire didn't matter, nothing mattered. I wasn't a retired firefighter or a homeowner or a plaintiff. I was just a son who had lost his father's grove, A father who had promised this land would one day be his daughter's legacy. And now nothing, all because a few suits with badges believed fire was more convenient than conscience. The fire department finally arrived 30 minutes later. By then the blaze had already consumed half the eastern ridge and was advancing toward the main street where the HOA offices stood. Structure threaded Hilltop and Mesa Ridge, one firefighter shouted into a radio. "It's moving fast." The wind shifted again, and then I saw it, the smoke column twisting, turning back on itself as if it had a mind of its own. The flames that had torn through my grove with relentless speed were now leaping the street, crawling up the manicured lawns of the HOA's model homes. They thought fire was a tool, but it wasn't a tool anymore. It was a reckoning. As the engines scrambled up the road and hoses unfurled like silver serpents, I stood back and watched, not with joy, not with vengeance, but with the same hollow silence of someone who had seen fire take more than it ever gave. I could hear the pop of decorative fencing igniting, the brittle crackle of synthetic siding melting. HOA trucks parked along the curb began to smolder, then detonate one by one, fueled by the very gas they'd used in those forbidden burn barrels. Ellie stood beside me, her hand wrapped in mine. She didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing to say. This wasn't justice. It was simply cause and effect. Hours later, after the flames died down and the smoke turned from black to gray, a sheriff approached us. His face was smeared with ash, his helmet under one arm. "You the property owner?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice raspy. "We'll need a full statement. The county's bringing in state fire investigators. This is going to be big." I nodded. Behind him, I saw Kevin Riles, the HOA president, standing in the ruins of what had been the board's clubhouse. His red blouse was now gray with soot. He was on the phone, pacing frantically, pointing at everything and nothing. He caught my eye, his face twisted in something between terror and incredulity. He never thought the fire could come for him, but fire doesn't care about titles or authority or self-importance. It only cares about fuel, and that day the HOA had given it plenty. Back at the house, I sat on the porch, knees stained with ash, hands trembling. Ellie brought me a cold towel and placed it on my neck. She didn't speak either. Instead, she walked over to the back fence, knelt in the dirt, and began digging. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Saving a root," she said quietly. "One of the old lemon trees might have survived underground. If it did, we can bring it back." I watched her work, watched her hope, and somewhere deep inside all that ruin, a single thought took root again. They took everything, but not forever, not if we fight smart, and not if we refuse to let them write the story's end. The worst kind of tragedy is the one you saw coming, and I had seen this coming like headlights on an unlit highway. Weeks before the fire, I'd filed not one but two formal complaints against the HOA. The first was a letter, certified and time-stamped, addressed to the board president, the property manager, and the neighborhood safety committee. The second was a digital submission to the county's fire prevention division, complete with drone photos, location tags, and weather advisories. I had taken every legal step I could. I knew their burn plans were reckless. I had witnessed their landscaping crews lighting trash piles on parched ground in late summer when a single ember could have wiped out an entire block. I'd even documented them doing it on cell phone videos from my second-story window, where their so-called maintenance crew tossed matchsticks onto overgrown brush beside a retaining wall. The HOA called it beautification. I called it a loaded gun with no one watching the trigger. When the complaints went unanswered, I followed up politely at first, then firmly. I flagged the fire risk in bold print, attached satellite images, quoted the state fire code. I even drove to the HOA office to ask in person why my certified letter hadn't been acknowledged. The receptionist gave me that practiced smile of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult residents. "Oh, I'm sure it's in the queue," she said, tapping her keyboard. "We've been very busy planning the fall community cleanup, but I can leave a note for Kevin to review it." "You mean the same cleanup where he wants to use open flames on a red flag warning weekend?" Her fingers stopped typing. I left without another word. I'd spent years in fire safety, some working wildfire control lines in the Sierras. I know what negligence looks like, and this HOA board reeked of it. They weren't just clueless, they were dismissive. Kind of people who believed rules were for other people. The kind who wore badges and carried clipboards and thought those things granted them power. So I kept records, emails, photos, copies of every complaint. I didn't know when it would matter, but I knew someday it would. And then the grove burned, and suddenly my paper trail became a fuse. After the fire, I sent the full archive, every file, photo, and timestamp to the county fire inspector assigned to the case. His name was Lieutenant Grant. Broad-shouldered, non-nonsense, the kind of man whose eyes told you he'd seen houses go up like matchboxes. He met me at the edge of the grove, boots crunching over blackened soil. I handed him the manila folder without a word. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and raised an eyebrow. "You warned him 3 times, he said. "Once directly, twice with documentation." I nodded slowly. "And they acknowledged receipt. They never replied." He pulled out a paper from the folder, a screenshot of the HOA's community forum post claiming they followed all proper procedures. Grant snorted. "They're going to regret that." Within days, the county issued a statement. The burn was unauthorized. No permits had been issued. The HOA had not coordinated with the fire captain nor filed the necessary pre-burn risk assessments. Worse, the fire line originated inside the boundary of HOA-managed common grounds. That meant full liability. The press caught wind of it next. Local news ran a segment titled HOA Inferno, Did Neighborhood Board Spark Disaster? They used drone footage from my neighbor's camera, the same one I'd used in my complaint. The video zoomed in on two men in yellow vests dumping accelerants near a patch of overgrown grass directly across from my grove's fence line. They'd lit the fire, walked away laughing, and never looked back. Then the anchors cut to a shaky clip of me standing in front of what used to be my shed, the grove behind me still smoldering. I warned them, I said into the camera. They ignored every warning, and now they want to pretend it was an accident. The video went viral. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years started showing up at my door with casseroles and pies. Some offered to help dig out the stumps. Others just stood on the porch and said it should never have happened. But not everyone was sympathetic. One morning I found a letter taped to my front door. You're tearing this neighborhood apart, let it go. No name, no return address. I kept it, of course, evidence. I started to notice dark trucks circling my block more often. Same tinted windows, same license plates. One of them parked across the street for a full hour one night, lights off. I didn't scare easy. I used to run into fire while other people ran out. So I installed new floodlights, bought a second set of motion-activated cameras, and I kept my file folder close. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the following week. Only board members allowed, no public comment. But I had friends who listened from the hallway. They told me it was chaos. Some wanted to apologize, others to lawyer up. Kevin, I heard, looked like he hadn't slept in days. Then came the letter from their legal counsel, offering a goodwill compensation agreement if I agreed to drop my complaint and refrain from further public statements. It wasn't even close to the value of what I'd lost. But that wasn't the point. They were trying to buy silence. Instead, I filed an amended complaint, this time adding obstruction, retaliation, and bad faith negotiations. The fire had already burned my grove. Now I was going to burn down the lies that tried to cover it up. The forecast had called it a brief wind event, but anyone who's lived out here long enough knows better. There's no such thing as a brief wind event when the Santa Anas roll in. These aren't summer breezes. They're heat-charged currents that blow down from the desert, funnel through dry canyons, and whip neighborhoods into tinderboxes. It was late afternoon. The sky that strange, burnt gold color that makes your instincts twitch. I stood at the edge of what used to be my grove, staring at blackened rows and ashy soil. Ellie had gone to stay with her aunt for a few days. She needed air that didn't smell like smoke. I was alone. That's when I felt it, the shift. At first just a rustle high in the dead branches above me, then a stronger gust blowing in the opposite direction from the fire's origin. I closed my eyes and counted 1 on 1,000, 2 1,000. Then a sudden gust nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. It was happening again, the same pattern I'd seen years ago in the foothills outside Chico. A stable burn destabilized by late-day wind, except this time the burn wasn't stable to begin with. It had been a pile of dry brush lit by fools with no permits and even less judgment. I turned toward the HOA district just beyond the hilltop. The fire had already scorched the common area near the bike trail, then backed off. But with this wind reversal, everything was in play again. HOA homes were designed to be picturesque. Matching roof tiles, vinyl siding, decorative shutters that had never seen a hinge, pretty on the outside, hollow underneath. A fire crawling into that development was like a wolf finding the hen house. I didn't call 911, I called Caleb. Winds turned, I told him, from the southeast, picking up fast. He didn't hesitate. You think it'll jump? I don't think, I said, I know. Within 20 minutes I heard the sirens, but it was too late. I climbed the ridge behind the grove with my binoculars. From there you could see the whole HOA loop, Sycamore Court, Willow Bend, Cedar Path. Smoke was already curling up behind the tennis courts. Somewhere near the clubhouse I saw a flash of orange, then another. The fire was back, only now it was marching toward the same people who'd caused it. At first they scrambled like ants. SUVs screeched out of driveways. I could hear faint shouts echoing through the canyon, someone yelling for a dog, another banging on a neighbor's door, and in the middle of it all was Kevin Riles. He ran up the sidewalk in his pressed khakis, clutching a garden hose in one hand and barking into a phone with the other. He sprayed a pathetic arc of water over some hedges as flames crept down the slope behind his property. It was almost surreal. The same man who'd told me to maintain a proper fire break was now watching his backyard erupt in a wall of flame that didn't care about fire codes or board bylaws. I should have felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt hollow. I'd warned them. I'd begged them. I'd gone through every legal channel available, and none of it had mattered until the wind turned. The fire reached the HOA office around sunset. It was a low-slung building with solar panels, a flagpole, and a fake stone sign out front that read Harmony Hills Community Est, 1998. I'd always hated that name. There was never any harmony here. The flames consumed the sign first, then the panels exploded, loud pops that echoed like gunshots across the ridge. By the time the fire trucks made it through the barricades, 3 houses were fully engulfed. 2 more were smoldering, and the office was nothing but a blackened shell. I came down off the ridge as night fell. Fire crews were everywhere, hoses snaking down streets, emergency lights casting red and blue strobes across stucco walls. I walked slowly, hands raised to avoid being stopped. That's when I saw her. Corinne Mallister, HOA treasurer, always wore that ridiculous blazer, always acted like she was mayor of something. Now she was wrapped in a wool blanket, mascara streaked down her face, sitting on a curb in front of what used to be her 2-story Tuscan-style home. She looked up at me, her lips trembled. "This isn't fair," she whispered. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She knew, they all knew, they'd been warned. And now the reckoning had come, not in a courtroom, but in a firestorm that didn't distinguish between the guilty and the clueless. The next morning, the sun rose over a neighborhood still smoldering. Ash coated everything. The tennis courts were melted. Playground slides had warped into useless lumps of plastic. Lawns, once obsessively trimmed to regulation height, were black and brittle. Reporters showed up. Drones buzzed overhead. Slowly, details began to surface. Fire marshals released a statement. The new ignition had been traced back to embers rekindled from the original unauthorized HOA burn. No new flame had been introduced. The wind had simply carried what the board had already lit. There would be consequences, serious ones, and I would make sure they stuck, because this wasn't just a fire. There was proof that arrogance burns, that silence spreads like flame, and that sometimes justice comes not in the form of a courtroom gavel, but as a shift in the wind. I came back the next morning with my boots laced tight and my fireman gloves on, though there was nothing left to fight, not for me anyway. My grove was a charcoal graveyard. But as I crested the ridge and looked down into the HOA development, I saw something I never thought I'd see. Their perfect world symmetry and stucco and smug superiority was gone. Gone. What used to be pristine cul-de-sacs lined with cookie-cutter Tuscan-inspired homes now looked like a war zone. Not a single roof was intact. Driveways were scattered with the burnt-out frames of SUVs. Mailboxes stood like gravestones. The fake cobblestone welcome sign lay face down in the gutter, half-melted, reading simply, "Harmony High. Irony has a cruel sense of humor." The fire had moved fast through that area, and it didn't discriminate. It took the homes of board members and silent bystanders alike, and now ash blanketed everything. Lawns, fences, ceramic gnomes, all of it muted in the same grim gray. I spotted Kevin's house first. It had been the centerpiece of the HOA's pride. Cream-colored stucco, Spanish tile roof, a 6-foot water fountain in the yard that never worked right but looked expensive. The fountain was now a twisted hunk of concrete and iron, and the front windows had exploded outward from the heat. Inside, I could see through the entire structure. No ceilings left, no furniture, just the black skeleton of what had been a $750,000 executive property. He was there too, sitting on the curb with a clipboard in his lap, like that would still help. A dazed look in his eyes, not angry, not even scared, just hollow. He looked up and saw me. And for once he didn't speak. I didn't either. What was there to say? He'd already read the fire report. He knew exactly what had caused it. And worse, he knew I'd tried to stop it. I could see it in the way he avoided my gaze. Like a man who knows the ghost standing before him is still very much alive, I walked past him without slowing down. The fire hadn't just destroyed buildings. It had cracked the illusion of control the HOA had built brick by brick. That illusion had ruled our lives, dictated the color of our fences, the height of our grass, even the number of cars allowed in our own damn driveways. And now it had turned to smoke, literally. I made my way toward the community clubhouse, the so-called heart of Harmony Hills. That building had been their fortress, where decisions were made behind closed doors, where complaints were dismissed, neighbors were shamed, and violations were stamped out like smoldering coals. It was gone. The frame had collapsed inward. The HVAC unit sat on the sidewalk, toppled like a monument to wasted money. I recognized the melted frame of the Homeowner of the Year plaque on the lawn, its brass engraving distorted by heat. There was something poetic about it, and then I heard voices. Inside the blackened shell of what used to be the meeting hall, a cluster of HOA staffers were sifting through scorched file boxers, trying to salvage documents, maybe trying to cover tracks, more likely. I stepped in, crunching over glass. Karen turned around, startled. Her blazer, once cherry red and tailored to perfection, was now torn and flecked with soot. She looked like she hadn't slept, eyes red, mascara trailing like veins. When she saw me, she straightened and tried to smile. I didn't return it. "I suppose you're enjoying this," she said, her voice thin. "No," I said. "I would have preferred you listen the first time." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "We never meant for this," she mumbled. I walked past her and stared down at one of the filing cabinets. Its drawers hung open, charred folders dangling like tongues. Everything smelled of wet smoke and scorched ink. "You meant to cut corners," I said quietly. "You meant to make it cheap, fast, quiet, and now," I looked back at her, "you burned your own damn kingdom down." That afternoon, the county announced a formal investigation into the HOA board's conduct, not just for the unauthorized burn, but for mishandling funds, falsifying records, and obstructing community safety protocols. Turns out the maintenance project had been approved in a closed session without a public vote, a direct violation of the Open Meetings Act. The funds used for the landscaping company hadn't gone through standard bidding either. The company, it appeared, was owned by the cousin of one of the board members. It was textbook negligence dressed up in the language of bureaucracy. And now it was unraveling fast. The insurance companies refused to pay out, not when arson and decent liability was on the table. FEMA offered assistance, but limited, since the HOA had ignored state emergency orders. They weren't eligible for full disaster relief. Homeowners were furious, not just at the fire, but at the years of manipulation they hadn't noticed until now. There were petitions, demands for resignations. Some neighbors filed independent lawsuits. Others just moved away, their homes gone, their patients burned out along with their siding. As for me, I went back to my land, to the grove that wasn't anymore, and I began to dig, not just for roots or hope or catharsis. I began to dig because fire doesn't get the last word. Not here. Not with me. At first, I thought the fire would be the end of it. The climax, the catastrophe that finally brought everything to light. But it turns out the fire was just the spark, and the real explosion was bureaucratic. When the county's fire captain's office sent its preliminary report to the district attorney, it triggered an avalanche. What started as a civil liability investigation for illegal burning quickly morphed into something bigger, uglier, and far more systemic. It began with the permits, or rather the absence of them. No one could find a single valid burn permit filed by the HOA for the month the fire began. Kevin Riles had insisted for weeks that everything was properly authorized, even posting a letter on the HOA website claiming they had verbal authorization from a county inspector. That inspector, when interviewed, laughed outright. "I've never spoken to anyone from Harmony Hills," he said on record. "And even if I had, verbal authorization doesn't exist during a red flag warning. That's firefighting 101. But the smoking gun, pun fully intended, came from a whistleblower. A young man named Jordan Lee, who had worked briefly for the landscaping company contracted by the HOA, came forward with an audio recording. In it, Kevin's voice is unmistakable, calm, collected, and damning. "Now we don't need to wait for the paperwork." The county drags its feet. "By the time we get approval, we'll miss the cleanup window. Just do it before someone complains. If anyone asks, say we had it cleared." That clip made it onto the 6 o'clock news within 24 hours. Suddenly, this wasn't just about negligence. It was fraud, willful violation of public safety laws. And under the state's penal code, if someone recklessly sets fire to the property of another, it can be classified as a felony. They hadn't just destroyed my grove, they may have committed a criminal offense. From there, everything unraveled. The county subpoenaed HOA meeting minutes from the past 2 years. Half were missing. The other half had edits, deletions, and entire redacted paragraphs with no explanation. Turns out many of the closed sessions the board had held weren't legal at all. State law requires homeowner associations to notify residents and provide access to board discussions unless they fall under specific exceptions, none of which applied here. Then came the financial audit. Apparently, the board had diverted emergency funds meant for stormwater repairs toward the landscaping beautification initiative without disclosure, without votes, and without receipts that made any sense. A contractor named Greenland Resources LLC had received nearly $100,000 over 6 months. Except Greenland didn't exist in the Secretary of State's database. It was a shell registered under the name Trevor Riles, Kevin's younger brother. The dots connected themselves. They'd been funneling HOA dues into family-owned companies, cutting corners, and using fire as a cleanup tool while dressing it up in euphemisms like vegetation thinning. When I got the call from the county prosecutor's office, I was standing in my field, shovel in hand, digging around the one surviving lemon tree. "Mr. Baxter," the investigator said, "we'd like to formally ask if you'd be willing to testify when charges are filed." I didn't even hesitate. Gladly. I wasn't out for revenge, but I was done letting these people bury their lies under layers of policy language and fake smiles. They had operated like a cartel with lanyards. They hid behind bylaws, weaponized compliance notices, and shamed homeowners who questioned them. And now they were going to be held accountable. The court date was set for November. In the meantime, news outlets continued digging. A local journalist who had once written fluff pieces about HOA community engagement published an exposé that detailed 3 other incidents where the board had allegedly intimidated homeowners into silence. One couple had been fined $4,000 for repainting their door without approval, only to discover later that Karen Mallister had changed the paint palette guidelines without a vote just to keep their home from clashing with hers. Another resident, a 72-year-old veteran, had been harassed for an unauthorized flagpole installation on Memorial Day. It was all coming out now, and people were angry. The same residents who once turned away when I spoke up were now knocking on my door with signed petitions. They wanted the HOA dissolved, wanted new bylaws, wanted control returned to the people actually living in the homes, not the ones exploiting them. At the next emergency community meeting held in a borrowed church gymnasium because the HOA office was still a burnt husk, more than 300 residents showed up. Kevin didn't. Neither did Karen. Instead, their attorneys read prewritten statements about deep regret and unforeseen circumstances while most of the room sat stone-faced. Then someone passed me the mic. I hadn't planned on speaking, but when I looked at that crowd, faces of people I'd lived beside for years, people who'd once avoided eye contact with me in the grocery store, I realized they were ready to listen. So I told them about the grove, about the warnings, about the silence. "I didn't want to fight," I said. "I just wanted to grow fruit on land my family planted before I was born. I followed the rules. I filed the complaints. I rang every bell I could find, and they ignored it. They gambled with all of our lives, mine, yours, your kids, and they lost." A hush fell over the room, then someone stood and clapped, then another. And suddenly the gym filled with the sound of something I hadn't heard in months: support. For the first time, I didn't feel like a lone voice crying in the wind. I felt like a man standing with a community finally awake. The vote to remove the board passed with 97% approval. And the fire, it stopped being just a disaster. It became a turning point. The first time I held a fire hose, I was 19, trembling in a smoke-choked canyon north of Bakersfield, terrified out of my mind and pretending not to be. We were standing shoulder-to-shoulder on a hillside lit orange by flame, breathing through wet rags and digging lines with hands blistered raw. That was the day I learned two truths. Fire moves faster than fear, and the only thing that slows it down is someone willing to stand their ground. I never thought I'd need to remember that in a suburban neighborhood. But here I was again, this time not in uniform, not as part of a crew, but as a man with a ruined grove and a vista of ash around him, staring down a new kind of fire chaos. The day after the vote to dissolve the HOA board, I started getting knocks on my door. Not angry ones, not threats. These were neighbors, real neighbors coming with questions, with soot still in their hair and anxiety in their voices. Do you know how to check our attic for embers? Should I worry about my gas line? Can you teach me how to use this fire extinguisher? And the big one, can you help us build something better? They didn't want me to lead, they wanted me to teach. And I could do that, so I did. We started small. I printed off wildfire preparedness guides from the State Fire Agency's website, held an informal meeting on my lawn with a whiteboard salvaged from the scorched remains of the community center. At first, it was just 6 people, then 12, then 30. I taught them how to build defensible space, how to recognize ember traps around vents and wooden fences, how to clear brush without creating piles that turned into kindling, how to really read a wind map, not just the emoji forecast on their phones. And word spread. The neighborhood transformed, not from top-down orders, but from ground-up knowledge. People who used to glare at each other over lawn heights were now passing shovels and hauling dirt. Teenagers helped their elderly neighbors clear gutters. Dads turned grill nights into mullet-spreading parties. They didn't just clean up, they grew up, and all without a single compliance letter. Meanwhile, the ex-board members kept quiet. Kevin had gone radio silent. Rumor had it his house was uninsured due to fraudulent permit issues, and he'd lawyered up. Karen had moved in with her sister across town. She filed a countersuit for emotional distress after residents bombarded her with angry voicemails, but it was dismissed within weeks. I didn't gloat, I was too busy working. One morning I got a call from the fire captain himself, Lieutenant Grant. "Sam," he said, "we've been watching what's happening over there. The way you've got neighbors organizing, replanting, prepping. Ever consider doing it officially?" I laughed. "I'm retired." "Well," he said, "how about temporarily unretired? We're putting together a regional community fire readiness program. Volunteers, trainers, people who get it, and you clearly do." That's how I ended up in front of a classroom at the community college 2 towns over, teaching a workshop titled Neighborhoods That Don't Burn, Fire Readiness in a Dry World. Ellie came with me that first day. She sat in the front row, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't proud, but I saw the way she smiled when someone asked, "How do you know all this?" And I said, "Because once upon a time I watched fire take everything I loved." I didn't just teach though. Back home I kept working the land. Slowly, painfully, I began replanting the grove, not everything at once. I didn't have the money or the energy, but one row at a time. Ellie helped me every weekend she was free. We planted saplings where the old trees had burned. I kept the original layout, almonds to the west, citrus in the center, but this time I added a walking path along the edge for visitors. Because people were starting to come, not just neighbors, but journalists, students, even city planners, wanting to know how we turned an HOA disaster zone into a case study in community resilience. Someone even asked if we'd start charging admission. I told them no, this grove wasn't for profit, it was for healing. But I wasn't above accepting donations, bags of compost, borrowed equipment, even homemade lemonade from the widow down the street. Every contribution was a seed of goodwill. One afternoon, I found a note on my porch, handwritten, no name. I was part of the board, I voted for the burn, I didn't speak up, I regret it every day. But watching you rebuild, it gives me hope, thank you. I folded it up and slid it into the back pocket of my work jeans, because while fire consumes, it also reveals. It burns away the pretenses, the egos, the false facade. And what's left, if you're lucky, is the truth. The truth that real community doesn't come from bylaws or badges. It comes from shared scars, from hands in the dirt, from a willingness to say, we messed up and we're ready to do better. And when I looked out across the blackened field, now dotted with little green shoots and orange flag markers for saplings yet to come, I didn't see loss anymore. I saw resilience. And I knew this time they were listening. The courthouse didn't look like much from the outside, just another sandstone box in the middle of the county seat with faded flags and squeaky doors. But on the morning of the hearing, it felt like the center of gravity had shifted. News vans lined the curb. A crowd buzzed outside carrying signs that read, "Justice for the Grove, no more HOA lies, and stop arson by policy." Inside, it was even more surreal. I'd been in courtrooms before, testifying on arson investigations back in my firefighting days. But I'd never sat in the plaintiff's seat as the one who'd lost everything. The seats behind me filled quickly. Neighbors, journalists, former HOA members who had either quit or been pushed out. Some had bandaged hands from cleanup work. Others wore oxygen tubes, still recovering from smoke inhalation. They came anyway, not because of me, but because they were tired of being silenced. At the front sat Kevin Riles, flanked by 2 attorneys in suits that probably cost more than his mortgage. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. The man who once barked orders from the dais at HOA meetings now slouched pale, shrinking beneath the courtroom lights. Corinne sat 2 rows back. Her lawyer had filed a motion to sever her case, citing unrelated procedural matters, but the judge denied it. She'd be tried alongside the rest. When the bailiff called the case Samuel Baxter versus Harmony Hills Homeowners Association et al., the room fell into an almost electric silence. My attorney, Lacey Torres, rose with calm precision. She was half my age, 3 times sharper, and never missed a detail. A former environmental prosecutor turned private litigator, she took this case pro bono after reading about it in the paper. This isn't just about a fire, she said in her opening statement. This is about abuse of power. About individuals entrusted with community safety who chose ego over responsibility. It's about a man who did everything right, filed warnings, followed the law, and lost everything because a group of people thought they were above it. She let the silence hang before continuing. And it's about making sure that never happens again. The defense tried to spin it. They argued the fire was a result of changing wind conditions and miscommunication between contractors. They claimed Kevin had acted in good faith and that the HOA was a volunteer organization without expertise in wildfire mitigation. Then they made the mistake of putting Kevin on the stand. Lacey didn't flinch. She pulled up the audio recording Jordan's clip of Kevin instructing the landscapers to proceed before someone complains. The courtroom speakers crackled with his voice, smug and calm. Then she projected the burn bin PDF from the county website onto a screen, dated and timestamped 2 days before the fire. She followed that with my certified letter of warning, the email thread, the drone photos, the HOA's own meeting minutes redacted and missing timestamps. One by one, she built the case like a controlled backburn type, methodical, leaving nothing unscorched. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't read from notes. I spoke plainly. I told them about the grove, about my father's hands planting the first trees, about the scent of lemon blossoms in spring, about the night I watched the flames take it all. But I also told them about what came after, the neighbors who showed up with shovels, the kids who helped haul mulch, the new walking path lined with seedlings planted by hands that once feared fire. This wasn't just about me, I said, my voice rough. It was about all of us. About what happens when a few people in power forget that their job is to protect, not control, and about what's possible when we stand up and say enough. There wasn't a sound in the courtroom when I stepped down, not even from the judge. Corinne took the stand briefly. Her lawyer tried to steer her into a remorseful arc, but she crumbled. Under cross-examination, she admitted that she had approved the budget reallocation without notifying homeowners, that she had seen my complaint and chosen not to escalate it because she didn't want to deal with Sam. That sentence echoed, didn't want to deal with Sam, as if my grove, my land, my warnings had been an inconvenience, a nuisance, something easier to ignore than to confront. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict, liable on all counts, gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized activity during emergency order, destruction of private property. Kevin and Corinne were personally named in the judgment. The HOA, now defunct, was ordered to pay damages, some from its dwindling reserve fund, the rest from liability insurance. But even more impactful than the money was the mandate. Harmony Hills HOA was to be dissolved permanently, its assets redistributed, its enforcement mechanisms nullified, and its former members barred from participating in any future governance structure in the district. When the judge read the decision, Kevin didn't move. Corinne started crying. Outside, the crowd erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in release. People cheered, others simply hugged. Some just stood there looking up at the courthouse steps like a dam had finally broken. The reporters swarmed, but I didn't speak. Instead, I walked home alone. I crossed the scorched cul-de-sac past the melted lampposts, turned left where the maple trees used to be, and as I approached my property, I saw a child, maybe 8, kneeling by the new saplings Ellie and I had planted. She held a little tin watering can and poured slowly, carefully, not even noticing me. I didn't interrupt, because that was the moment I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The fire may have taken homes in the board's illusions, but what rose from its ashes that belonged to all of us? Spring came late that year. The rains had held off until March, hesitant and unsure, like even the sky wasn't sure if it was safe to return. But when they finally came, they came steady, soaking the charred ground, softening the scars, coaxing the smallest signs of green from soil that had once been nothing but ash. And on one of those mornings when the clouds broke open like a sigh, I walked a new path along the edge of the grove and heard something I hadn't heard in months. Birdsong, not just a stray chirp of a sparrow, but a chorus. Warblers, mockingbirds, even a blue jay that seemed to scream at me from the top of a young lemon tree as if to say, "We're back, old man, you're not alone anymore." I smiled. The saplings were coming in slow but strong. Ellie had labeled each one with hand-painted tags. Hope, persistence, Ellie's favorite, Granddad's corner. My favorite stood near the center of the grove, a golden bell graft we weren't sure would take, but it did. Against all odds, that fragile stock had held through frost, rain, and trauma. Its leaves now shimmered like they'd never known fire. The community changed too. Without the HOA, something strange and beautiful had started to take root. It wasn't chaos as the old board had warned. It wasn't lawlessness. It was real connection. Neighbors formed a volunteer council, not for control but coordination. Nothing binding, nothing enforced by threat, just people keeping each other informed. Garden swaps, neighborhood watches, tree planting Saturdays. Ellie started a compost collective. Kids riding bikes with buckets, picking up scraps and returning with soil for gardens they'd never seen until now. Mr. Lang from 3 houses down built a seedling shelter in his garage. He'd never spoken more than 10 words to me before the fire. Now we exchanged recipes over fencing wire. The lot where the HOA office once stood was cleared in April. The community voted to turn it into a public grove, a memory space. Not a park, not a playground, just a quiet place with benches and native plants and a little plaque that read, "From the fire we grew back stronger." It was Ellie's idea. She read the final line aloud at the dedication ceremony, standing tall in a sun hat, tears in her eyes. I didn't speak that day. Didn't need to. My hands were covered in soil and sap, and that said more than any speech ever could. Kevin and Karen were gone. Kevin moved out of state, no one really knew where. Karen tried to start over in a different neighborhood but couldn't outrun the articles, the court records, or her own name. Last I heard, she'd filed for bankruptcy. I didn't celebrate that. I just let it be because I'd found peace. And peace isn't something you protect by pointing fingers. It's something you plant. The grove wasn't just mine anymore. That was the most unexpected part. Kids helped water the trees. Retirees came and weeded the pathways. Someone set up a lending library at the old tool shed. A retired teacher offered outdoor reading lessons to kids who had fallen behind during the months of disruption. We even hosted our first neighborhood harvest festival that fall. It wasn't big, no sponsors, no HOA-approved catering. Just pies, folding chairs, hay bales, music, and laughter. And me sitting under the first tree to bear fruit again, holding a lemon in my hand and thinking about all the ways life had once tried to burn me down. But the thing about fire is it's not just a destroyer, it's a revealer. It shows you what's dead, what's fragile, what was never built to last, and it clears space for what's next. Real community, real responsibility, real roots. There are still tough days. Rain still falls. The scars are still there on the trees and the soil and inside me. But they don't sting like they used to. They don't define the grove. They're just part of its story now. Sometimes people ask me if I'm proud of what I did, filing the lawsuits, going public, refusing to back down. And the truth is no, I'm not proud. I'm grateful. Grateful that I lived to see the land heal. Grateful that my daughter saw what standing up looks like and what growing back can mean. And most of all, grateful that justice came not with revenge but with roots, with peace, with community. Because in the end, we didn't just rebuild what burned. We built something better.